Hello, everyone. We'll find a seat. People are trickling in, but we have such a full program. We're going to begin. Climate change. Climate change. What does it mean to experience it, to endure it, to apprehend it, to become sensitized to it, and thereby to face it, to challenge it, to debate it, to redirect it, to intervene in it? Okay, that's fine. Thank you. That's an intervention from Arlie's phone. So, and then what, moreover, for us tonight are the role of the arts and the roles that arts and culture workers might play in these processes of sensitization and intervention. Good evening once again. My name is Shannon Jackson. I have the privilege of serving as Associate Vice Chancellor for the Arts and Design here at UC Berkeley, a job that seeks to synchronize and mobilize and catalyze an incredible creative culture on our campus and off our campus. And it's a privilege to welcome you to one of our special programs, A+D Mondays, a program that's co-curated by some dozen schools and departments, centers, presenting venues on our campus, where we bring together the people and ideas that most compel the Berkeley faculty, and where we think together about the role of creativity, arts, design, and culture in the big questions of the day. This Monday series this year is unified by a central theme: fact and fiction. A little capacious, pretty capacious, timely, too timely. Tonight and throughout the year, we're going to consider the blurring distinctions between these terms: fact and fiction, truth and lies, the real and the artificial. Sometimes those blurs can be productive, and sometimes not so productive. And we're going to think about the combination, seeking solutions, but also speculation, thinking about what it means to mix a quest for accuracy with a quest for the imagination, and thinking also about what it means to join sensitization with intervention. We're going to explore, as we have throughout already and will continue throughout the year, the role of, you could say, critical creativity in education, in politics, for our region, and for our world. And tonight, we get to take that theme, fact and fiction, to a new level. Having witnessed, as some of you have, many of us in the room, the conclusion of Governor Jerry Brown's Global Climate Action Summit, a gathering whose tagline was indeed, "Take ambition to the next level." As many of you know, creatives were a central part of that action and that ambition. Many here, some on the stage, saw and hosted a range of creative exhibitions, screenings, performances, installations, interventions. For me, the month recalled the feeling of being in Paris at the Climate Accords, Art COP21, which responded to COP21 at the time, where all kinds of artists were taking over the entirety of Paris. Some of you might remember or might have seen photos of one of the signature public art interventions during the Paris Climate Summit, Olafur Eliasson's Ice Watch Paris, in which 12 large chunks of ice, I'll say polar bear-sized chunks of ice, were arranged to represent a clock melting in order to keep track of the clock of global climate change. We now have here tonight our own melting ice, albeit slightly smaller, as well as symbolic image of coal, thanks to the artist and activist Carter Brooks. Thank you, Carter, for installing it. So we'll have that here as we think also once together about what installations like these, materials like these, art and culture like this has to contribute to our conversation now, in a different political situation than we were during Paris Climate Accords here in San Francisco. And we have a varied group of artists, journalists, and climate scientists, each in different combinations here to help us think about this role. Because we have such a full program, I'm going to count on you having read their illustrious biographies online. If you haven't, please do so. And I'm going to try to jump in pretty quickly to try to think about some of these synergies amongst arts, culture, and the vagaries and contingencies of grappling with global climate change and policy change. So, without too much ado, let me welcome our panelists to the stage. And as you come, I'm going to start off with a question. Is this okay? If you'll come, okay. Here we go. Okay, we have Orville Schell, Lynda Grose, Dan Kammen, Stephan Crawford, and Anno. And I'm going to start off and start to make my own way to joining them with a central question. First of all, as I said, this series throughout the year is titled Fact and Fiction. And I want to try to think together about what that dialectic, what those terms mean for us when it comes to climate change. Different speakers here, when you see the people assembled here, have different connections to this word fact, depending upon their professional positions as journalists, as scientists, as artists, and perhaps also different connections to the concept of fiction, whether that concept includes images, sound, or other forms that spark our imagination. So to start us off, I wanted to ask Orville Schell to think with us first about fact and fiction, to get us to think about those terms in the context of having just closed an incredible exhibition at Fort Mason, Coal and Ice, and also as our former dean of the journalism school, someone who obviously contends with people who have a particular investment in that word fact. Orville, can you start us off getting us going and sharing some of your thoughts too about what happened with your work in September? Great.
Well, I guess just to start off, I should say I am irrevocably a fact-based kind of guy, being a writer and believing in fact is sort of the basis of all logic. However, I also have to say that when it comes to a question like climate change, I sometimes despair that our ability to transmit the truth of facts seems to be incredibly spare. That why is it, we have to ask ourselves, people don't hear the incontrovertible fact of the threat that is approaching us, that is upon us. So this was really what lay behind this exhibit that Shannon mentioned, Coal plus Ice, which was an effort to bring together all kinds of different things, not just the spoken word or the written word, but to bring together photographic images, video, food, music, art, science, business, anything that might help people tune in. So I'll maybe say a few little things about it, but just I'll show you 2 minutes, just so those of you who didn't see it will have a chance. Okay, this is a very quick time lapse that Berkeley is a very high-speed tour. To give you some idea, one other, these are just a minute.
我来自中国山东。目前大家所看到这些肖像呢，其实就是当时我那几年工作的一些同事和工友。在大部分人看来，矿工的这个职业是一个非常苦难的一个职业，但实际上在当时对我们来说，能够获得这么一份工作，是一件非常非常难得的事情。我希望大家能够通过我的作品，能够感受到这个传统能源对空气、对这个气候，有更多的关注和思考。
So this was an effort really to sort of bring all of the senses together to focus on climate change. This is one of some 30-odd different photographers, videographers that were represented in this show. And then in the middle of it, we had events. We had a big performance space. We could sit up to 1,000 people. And we had the governor's dinner for his climate summit. And finally, since I know time is short, let me just say one place where fact and fiction sort of blur together for me. For me, the most wonderful event we did was with the opera director, Peter Sellers, who's doing Mozart's first opera, Idomeneo, he wrote when he was 22. And Peter Sellers has interpreted this as a climate change opera. So he brought the soprano he's going to use in Salzburg when he does this next year, who's a wonderful Chinese soprano. By the way, China's important here. That's what I do, because China's the largest carbon emitter in the world. So this opera is a long 2.5, 3-hour opera on the Trojan War. So how do you get to climate change? Well, Peter Sellers did this mesmerizing kind of tour of the opera where he's saying essentially that in that opera, as the Greeks come back from the Trojan War, Poseidon unleashes terrible hurricanes and tidal waves and destroys them all. Why? Because they have meddled with the natural order. They've disturbed the moral order of the universe with their horrific war, which any of you who've read the Iliad will know about. And he thought this was sort of a metaphor for what we are now doing in terms of our disturbance, our perturbation of the natural world. And that's why he wanted to do this opera. And it was a wonderful oblique way to sort of get at a whole bunch of people who may love opera, but how are you going to get them to a climate change exhibit? So there they were. We trapped them right in the middle. They had to come in. They had to come through it in order to get to this. So I think that we have to have a very broad construal when we deal with these very sort of real problems like climate change, that if you're going to convince people in any sort of broadly based sense of the word, you have to bring to bear more than just science, more than just fact, more than just browbeating and logic and deduction, all these things we learn at universities, and which have an essential basis for everything that men do that puts them higher on the food chain than animals. But alas, when it comes to climate change, I'd have to say we're not doing a very good job at it yet. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, Orville. Well, think about also the themes of all the senses, because we have many senses specialists in different senses here, and also the idea of a classic being reinterpreted, which I think is also a theme for Kim. I think it's interesting to think about needing to use an exhibition or performance in order to get people to think about science, and then sometimes at Berkeley I find myself doing the opposite, of saying, promise, there'll be science here. Come and see the art. But what it is to mobilize and put them all together is, a central theme. And also now when we think about, as I said, a range of senses and think about a range of forms, if you think about the difference between an exhibition of photography or the experience of cinema, a piece of music, a piece of theater, an installation art, a sculptural intervention on site. These are also all different kinds of art forms, different kinds of creative responses, environmental literature or poetry. So a lot of times I think it's also interesting to think about a range of cultural practices and not expect every single art practice to do the same thing. It might be that different art practices have different roles to play in different types of sites and venues. And I wanted to push on that theme a little bit more to differentiate. So we're not talking about the arts as if they're all one thing, or culture as if it's all one thing. And to do that, I wanted to ask Dan and then Stephan to take things from different angles. Dan is often here helping us and playing the resident policy person, the resident climate scientist, the resident nuclear physicist for it. Good to have one in every house. But also somebody who's a tremendous art supporter and a tremendous advocate for cultural strategies when it comes to climate. So Dan, could you set us off about what you think about this full spectrum that Orville's talking about? Yeah, yep, they're up. They should be up there. And Massimo's on hand if it does.
I probably won't know how to restart it, but I also want to thank you for doing this because I'm a son of two historians, and so my view of the United States was my parents wanted to go from historic monument to historic monument around the country, and I wanted to do everything I could to avoid that experience. And so I feel like I came to understand the value of narrative and the value of, sorry, I should be able to do it. And the value of a dialogue between the arts and the humanities sort of late in life. And in fact, I've been at Berkeley 19 years now, and the biggest thing for me has been to figure out some of the aspects of doing that. So Carter's exhibit here, which is uses some of our coal. Just as an example, this is kind of what you normally think of as coal. This is actually contested or conflict coal. This is Navajo coal. And in front, this is Kosovar coal that powers the dirtiest power plant in Europe. And both of them are stories where I can tell you the elemental composition, we do mass spec analysis, we do all the kind of stuff that my STEM background leads us to do, but we don't capture any of this narrative story. And as we kind of figure out why are we not getting the climate change science and the energy solutions opportunities clear in people's minds, I think it's actually largely because of that. We haven't figured out how to use the science to, so trying to think about this sort of narrative story. And so one of the narratives which is kind of very powerful to me is how sadly slow, but how inextricably you can make things change. And so we have a range of ages in the audience here, and we have times when we provided GIs with cigarettes. We had talk show hosts who used cigarettes. We had doctors who recommended certain cigarettes. Cartoon characters, we had presidents and movie stars, sometimes together, smoking cigarettes. And that's one story of a pollutant very close to home. And the interesting bit of that is that while it was far too slow to respond, I guess even the machine is slow, but it took us decades to beat down, wow, this is it's now going to have a mind of its own in Phil. Okay. But it took us decades to beat down a pollutant that we were doing to ourselves that we knew was critical, and the narrative part of this was clearly lost, because even though all of these things built a story to finally bring it down, we actually thought at one point, this is a picture of an airplane from the 1970s, and we actually thought that a solution to this problem was to have the darker smoking rows, and then we have non-smoking rows. And somehow the science of, well, the air molecules, I guess they can't go through that barrier between the smoking and the non-smoking. I mean, this just shows a fundamental lack of understanding or an inability to tell the narrative story. Even if we thought that smoking was good or bad, surely this is not a solution. And yet we all accepted this as part of the norm on airplanes for a very long time. So are we really this dumb? And I don't mean Are we really this dumb to smoke or not smoke? I mean, are we really this dumb to actually delude ourselves into this as a solution? This says that we either don't understand the science or don't understand the narrative, or I would argue both. Now, on the other end, there are some absolutely fascinating transitions. And one of my colleagues, Chris Jones, if you can raise your hand, is in the room. And what Chris builds are carbon footprint and resource calculators, where we can look at things like, are you living in a highly polluted or a non-polluted area based on using solar power or wind or coal? And we have technologies now available to us. Well, this one's not quite available yet from Tesla, but that really sort of bridge the gap. This is both a beautiful version of a truck, but it's also one that tells a fascinating narrative. It's not just a vehicle that has no tailpipe emissions, that can do 500 miles on a charge, that can be recharged on solar power, but it's also one that will allow you to think totally differently about the experience of being a trucker, of moving goods around, of how we manage our climate footprint. And it's thinking about the opportunities for things like this that I think are one of these bridges between what Shannon mentioned, the science story, the narrative, and are there vehicles, and this is a physical vehicle, but are there also other vehicles that get us there? Now, if you look at a map of the United States and you see what is the mileage that you get in your electric vehicle, same exact electric vehicle, but the mileage you get is a function of what you're burning there. And so thinking about why, if we run that vehicle in an area that's relatively clean, like the Northwest with lots of hydro, or California with a lot of renewables, we get a vehicle which is totally different in its impact. Say the same thing in Oklahoma, same vehicle, totally different system. We're not telling the narrative about how to get to these types of vehicles. Just like for decades, we've had a known story about pollution and people's health, and particularly that for women and children. This is in Kibera, in Nairobi's largest slum, where we're talking about cook stoves with people who are knowingly burning the dirtiest fuels because that's all they have available, and yet we have technologies and practices that could clean that up. And so we have not learned the story about taking advantage of the rise of smart distributed technologies that allow us to do much more cleanly. That's not a science story. That's actually this narrative approach. And so the last narrative I want to show is one of the things that I would like to think cuts through a great deal of the debate about, is climate a Democrat or Republican issue or whatever. This is a 17-second movie produced by NASA. It's obviously synthetic, so the clouds have been removed, but it's going to show you the amount of sea ice over the North Pole, where of course there's no continent, at the time of year when it's at its minimum. And the narrative that this short video tells you is, in my view, worth the thousands and thousands and thousands of papers that we scientists exchange, but yet this tells you the whole story so much more rapidly and so much more clearly. So this is the total sea ice. This is in million square kilometers. And of course, the amount of ice each year when the ice is at its minimum, usually late August or early September, bounces around. But as we've seen from 1980, for any of you who have watched Chasing Coral or Chasing Ice, have seen a story of this incredible change. So over these 30 years, we have seen the amount of ice at minimum in the summer drop in half. No model, no argument about who's right or who's wrong about it. That's simply the data. And yet, we can do as many papers in the top scientific journals, but we don't tell the narrative. Now, the last thing I wanted to add is that California, as now hopefully everyone here knows, has some of the most amazing climate laws in the world. We sort of battle with Germany over whose law is doing better. You, us, not Germany. But I would predict if we are at all successful in internalizing all these messages, the piece of California's climate law that's going to be the most important as we look back on it from 2030 and 2040 is not actually the scientific targets, reducing our emissions by 30%, 50%, 70%. It's that California's new climate law does something unheard of before in environmental legislation. Our climate law says that we're required to spend 35% or more of all the money, not just on climate change, but on climate change as it affects disadvantaged communities, communities of color, immigrant communities. And that's the piece of it that actually I think gives us the most chance to solve it. It's a narrative about equity, not just a narrative about the percentage of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So I look forward to the conversation. I hope that kind of gets some of us thinking about some of the power of the narrative here.
As Stephan takes the stage, let's try to think about ideas about narrative, about storytelling, next to what Stephan's going to offer in terms of we'll say, a sonic perspective.
Okay. So, what do we want the future to sound like? This question prefaces all of our work at the Climate Music Project. Implicit in it is the idea that we still have a choice. In everything we do, we focus on two core messages. First, that action is urgent on climate change, but also that we can still avoid potentially catastrophic consequences if we choose to act now. So at the Climate Music Project, we communicate a sense of urgency about climate change by combining climate science with the emotional power of music to drive meaningful action. So the question is, why do we turn to music in this context? And this is why. I hope you can all read that. This is a representative audience comment following one of our performances. And I think you'll see that it does reflect the answer, which is that music resonates and can communicate intuitive insight extremely well. It can help us take something that's abstract and make it very personal. Music is personal. So our work at the Climate Music Project relies on the coming together of science, the arts, and technology. An important point is that we create and enable the creation of science-guided art, not art-guided science, if that even exists. There is a necessary element of subjectivity in what we do, since of course there's no way to express what a 4-degree world would sound like objectively. Also, by leaving scope for the artist's voice to be heard in each distinct composition, that ensures that the end result will resonate as music and not merely as sonified data, which few people would want to listen to. So although there is a subjective element in our work, by referencing and reflecting the objective reality inherent in data, this music also takes on a deeper meaning than music that's purely subjective in this context. So this is an idealized protocol of how we go from data to music. The thing to point out here, and I won't go into detail, but the thing to point out is that the science team and the artist each have their own distinct domains, but there is a good deal of interaction between them and reality checking that goes on frequently between them as we go through the process. In the next 2 slides, I'll explain what approaches and techniques we use very briefly. With respect to the rules, we don't define the rules narrowly, but rather they relate to our science team's interpretation of the story in the data, and then their guidance provided to the artist to ensure that the artist's work remains firmly within that narrative. So we understand approaches to be points of departure in the compositional process. There are many different approaches that we could use. In our early work, we've settled on 2. We've dubbed them the constructive approach and the deconstructive approach. We understand the constructive approach to be where the composer works with the data and the science team from the start to identify musical ideas and then develop those musical ideas into a composition. That's contrasted by the deconstructive approach, which is where the artist goes off to the mountain, comes back with the musical idea, and then sits down with the science team to explore the musical consequences of, in effect, colliding that idea with the data. There are many techniques that we could use. In our early work, we've been using a form of what's called parameter mapping, which is where variables in the system that we want to model, the climate system, are assigned analogs in the musical score. These analogs then track changes in the climate variables as measured against a reference value over time. So for example, CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is assigned tempo in the musical score, and then the tempo moves as the CO2 concentration moves. Just very briefly, looking ahead for the next 2 years, what we plan to do is we will continue to do live events at high-profile events, live music. We'll disseminate digital content, enable new content across many genres of music, and then circle everything back to a network of solutions partners. Here's one more audience quote, and then let me just tee up a little video to show you guys, give you a little feel of the music. Just to preface this clip, the clip is from our first composition, which is called Climate by composer Eric Ian Walker. This composition models four physical and chemical variables over 450 years, from 1800 to 2250 AD. From about 2014 on, it tracks two future scenarios. One is the bad news scenario, and one is a better news scenario. This clip covers 100 years, from 1930 to 2030, and this segment actually tracks the bad news scenario. So with that, let's go ahead and run a clip. Just, is it? Okay. You'll have to come to a show to see how it ends.
Also, just to knit together a comment made by Dan with what we just experienced here, coming to a show, imagining coming to a show with Stephan's work. Dan reiterated how important climate law is in California for its focus on equity, which is in part also the realization that the effects of climate change, while in the future would potentially be total and similar for all of us, along the way are really different for different communities. And a whole lot of what we're hoping to work toward is attending to that difference and attending to the equity issues in climate. That, I think, is an interesting segue to, I know, a preoccupation for Kim Anno about how we think about the role of the arts and creative intervention for different issues, for different communities. So not only that the arts are different, but also that the audiences who might receive them or reject them or debate or question or embrace an artistic intervention might be really different. So with that in mind, Kim, help us think about audiences.
I just want to say one thing. Stephen was mentioning to me that he played in Grace Cathedral, and the whole cathedral was packed. So you can just imagine this music in that location. Yes, I want to talk about audiences, and I'm going to flip through some pictures that you probably recognize, and through the lens of thinking about who are the audiences for these images. And I would like to dedicate the talk actually to the 1 million people living without drinking water in the San Joaquin Valley in 300 towns. We have 1 million people, just so you guys know, in our state, our beloved, environmentally friendly state. So I'm just going to talk first, just really quickly about a couple of people. One is, here is Marilee Latimer-Euclides, and she was a pioneer, and everyone knows this. Her audience was garbage workers. She spent many years, I think upwards of 10, is it 10 years? More than that? Oh my God, like it's 25 years then or something. Anyway, so her audience is pretty clear here, and that's really interesting. Of course, she does straddle the art world, inviting the public to see some of these projects. And we've seen it and we've digested it and thought about it, and she is still there working with the garbage workers. So to me, that is a super interesting notion of a sustained particular audience. David Buckland from CapeFarewell.com has a global audience, and his audience brings artists and scientists together to the Arctic Circle as well as youth. And for a while, they had a streaming camera that you could tap into the website and see the latest melt and listen to the sounds, like 24 hours a day. I'm not sure they could keep that up. But you could sort of see his global audience. And this is one of the artists, Rachel White-Reed, who went on a trip with the ships and came back and made this piece at the Tate, I believe. So you can see here is a book that documents many of the projects. So he's working with the art world, the media, the youth, the UK, and his global audience. And then here is Greenpeace, and I just bring them up because they're really influenced by visual art, and sometimes I think their work is art, and their audience is certainly global. It's certainly the media, and it's in every country. You can see them around the world. It's quite amazing, their feats. Even the executive director climbs up these things. And then here's an audience that's super local. I mean, this is a protest rally of women who were protesting what's happened to the water in their neighborhood. And this is their regalia, their dress for the protest, which I also view as art and culture and kind of the intertwining of such. And that's a very different audience. They're saying something to each other and to others. And then this is inspired by Lynda Grose. We'll talk a little bit about fashion. The fast fashion industry, what has it done globally? You'll learn a little bit more about that. But this image transcends a lot of things. This is an image in the countryside. I believe it's in Pakistan, isn't it? And then, but the sign is in English. So who's the audience? We are, you know, as is this one. And they're very interesting to me because they're both talking about the light side and the dark side, forming collaboratives to make work and then, or to make fashion and then sell them, but also talking about fast fashion at the same time. So it's kind of complex. This is the audience of Hong Kong and the shark fin soup debate by local Hong Kong artists. This is the art piece by Mia Foyer, who's in the audience tonight. Mia, raise your hand. Mia is a sculptor, and she made a mobile station proposal to sink the mobile station, and she brought it along. It was going to be a commission in Washington, D.C. Eventually, she was unable to get it funded, but the piece still lives in my mind really large as a really interesting way to think about public art and intersect with it. This is another one of her pieces called Boreal at the Corcoran. And then I believe this is in Rio de Janeiro. You can tell by that hill. These are all plastic bottles. So the audiences are, I mean, they have to be global in certain ways, but then also not. And these are certainly made by people that, I mean, I'll go back just 1 second. An artist from Brazil. And yet it was for environmentalists, an environmentalist audience, which I thought was interesting. Of course, Banksy, both the street and the art world, because he also makes money both, so he straddles his feet in both. And then this is Jason DeCaires Taylor, and these are his underwater sculptures. This one is off of Spain, which kind of refers to the migrants. It hasn't yet grown, but it grows gently over time with these corals that take over the statues. So the audiences become the traveler, the tourist, the scuba diver. It's another one. This one is in Cancun. And then this is Rachel Sussman. Rachel Sussman is photographing the oldest living things in the world. So she's going around the world to find things that are living many, many years. And this is Alejandro Duran, washed up, transforming a trashed landscape in Mexico. This is Venezuela. And this is this is Simon Salatis, urban calligrapher and artist. And then this is Spencer Tunick's photograph for the Wagner opera recital in Munich. And these are all naked people painted, you can kind of see. And they're crawling up the Roman emperor. This is sort of slipping between, is it climate? Is it art? Is it opera? For me, it's all those things. It's very interesting to me because of that. Here's another one of his. Spencer Tunick, New York artist. This is Greg Siegel, 7 Days of Garbage Photography. So this is magazines audience, Art World, Vanity Fair audience. These are people and their garbage for 7 days. Mark Bamuthi Joseph, multimedia collaboration with the Astor Gates, Red, Black, and Green, a blues, imagines what environmental justice looks like in America's forgotten neighborhoods. This one was presented in Chicago. So he's really taking theater, having it inside the theater, and then outside in the neighborhood. Those are environmental hyphy bikes, choreographed by Mark Bamuthi Joseph. And then I'm just going to end with a few pieces of my own work, influenced in the beginning by Robert Longo in his Men in Cities and the kind of anxiety and the angst presented in those paintings. I also saw this photograph. This changed the course of my work in 2009. I saw this work, and this was a photograph of the Maldives government signing documents underwater. And as soon as I saw that photograph, my frame of reference changed fundamentally in my work. And this is one of my pieces, Jose Navarrete. We're doing training videos, training for life underwater. Here's another one. And then currently I'm making a project in South Florida and Cuba. It's called 90 Miles from Paradise. And I like that because paradise, some people in the States are looking at Cuba as the paradise, and Cuba's looking at the States as the paradise, and super interesting to me for an artist to operate in that kind of a situation. So I'm working with both South Florida actors, dancers, and participants, citizens. Here they are facing each other. We're kind of thinking a little bit about the backdrop of the political stress, but also coming together because they share the same ecosystem. And this is another project, Water City Berkeley. Again, working with young people who want to celebrate. They don't necessarily want just a dark future. Talk to a 19-year-old and ask them how they feel about climate change. They want their life back. They want to live some. They want to have some leisure time. So I'm very interested in that. And with that, I'll play this video.
Are those like us, the lost and found of paradise?
Aún así, mortales. Veamos esta vista una vez más.
Thank you very much.
Amazing panoply. Thank you, Kim. That incredible sweep. With that, I'm going to go to. Are we okay? Okay. A final thought. Having thought about arts, fact, fiction, a range of art forms, a range of audiences, we're thinking about the role of the arts in terms of messaging climate, but messaging sustainability. What about the practices of creation itself? Are the practices that we're using to create in the first place sustainable and contributing to a sustainable future? And we have an amazing person, Lynda Grose, to help us think about that question. Lynda?
So I just wanted to start off the conversation just by invoking a dear friend and colleague and collaborator, Kate Fletcher, and her project, Local Wisdom. And I just want to ask the audience a question that she would ask if she was here. And that is, can you think of a garment that you have kept for a long time? And perhaps it's been passed on to you or gifted to you, And if you can think of a person that's associated with it, perhaps. And then hold that for a little while. We'll revisit this later. But just from asking that question, you quickly realize that fashion is more than shopping. And it's more than the technical aspects of material provenance and processing that made it into an object. So I want you to sit with that for a while, and then we'll revisit that question. Or maybe some of your stories, share some of your stories later. So I'm a conventional fashion designer, and sometimes I feel like I'm at Alcoholics Anonymous. But I've actually come full circle, and actually I'm embracing that, and I really feel like we need to take fashion back from commerce as it's currently practiced. But I was exposed to fashion and sustainability while working at Esprit in the late 90s with the co-owner Doug Tompkins, big outdoors person, who used the, I could go into a lot of detail and can't and won't, but basically was exposed to environmentalists that he brought into the company, people like David Brower, Dave Foreman, Paul Ehrlich, talking about these bigger issues, and then trying to make that relevant to the business that we were working in, and being a designer, applying that not just to the operations of the company, but to the product itself. And that became known as a line of clothing called E-Collection, where you're looking at the impacts of the products that you make, you're identifying problems and bringing alternatives to market that are improvements upon that. We use the Elmwood Institute Guide to Eco-Auditing, so a local organization, Fritz Capra, Ernest Kallenbach, to guide that process. But in this particular case, you're working within the confines of a company, within the circle of style of a company, and you're limited by that business model that you're working in, even though it included things like organic cotton and Tencel and so on. If you've got more questions later, I can answer those sorts of questions. And when leaving Esprit in 1995, I was asked by the founder of the Sustainable Cotton Project, which is a non-profit organization, so going from the private sector into the non-profit sector. And this is an organization working with farmers in the San Joaquin Valley in the heart of the most intensive cotton system on the planet, to help to communicate what they were working on, help popularize organic cotton. So this was in like 95, 96, 97. Very well known for the farm tours where they bring people from industry and activists into the farms to meet with the farmers and experience that industrialized landscape, and then work together to try and bring organic through the supply chain. And we managed to persuade lots of companies, like including Patagonia, to switch to organic cotton. But I'm going to come back to that in a second. But what it involved was telling narratives, taking scientific information and putting it into very visual forms that people could take in and then take action on. So trying to create agency within the industry now, not beyond a single company. And one of the most effective ones that we put together was this image, which was based on scientifically based on the average, looking at the cotton growing states across America and the average yield of cotton per acre and the average spraying volume of chemicals per acre, and then working with brands and mills to estimate the amount of cotton that goes into a t-shirt, and it was about £1 at the time in the 90s. T-shirts were a bit heavier than they are now. And it was about 1/3 of a pound of chemical fertilizers and pesticides for each t-shirt. So that was very practical information that companies could take and then say, well, if my business is 1 million t-shirts, then I'm responsible for that many chemicals, and I can reduce that many chemicals if I implement an organic program. It was unscientifically applied, though. People picked this up. It was so effective, and it's still used out there. My students cite it back to me. No, that's only America, and it's only in the 90s, and things have shifted. So the scientific information isn't enough. How we use it, how we apply it, and doing the work to get to it, of course, is really important, not just using it as a communication vehicle. So just on a personal level, going down year after year after year, bringing companies into those fields, like I said, into the most productive farmland on the planet, we get 4 bales an acre of cotton, about 2 to 3 times the global average. And yet, also witnessing the surrounding communities that Kim alluded to earlier, which are impoverished. It's forgotten California, some people call it. It really made me reflect, you know, as an artist or creative person, often my eyes will be distracted and then my head follows and then my brain engages and you make sense of what you're seeing. And it really made me question, well, who's benefiting from this amount of productivity, this amount of extraction? That extractive economy really is what I became aware of. And especially being on the board of Goodwill Industries, a little bit odd slide there, but never mind, you get the idea. Witnessing this volume of stuff, these natural resources that are extracted, made into product and pushed through the system to waste at the other end. It's about 68 pounds of clothing a year that the average US person throws away. That's about 34 pairs of jeans, just to give you an idea. And that's an average, so someone's throwing away a lot more. You can't help, I couldn't help question this notion of growth and extracting more and more from the land, yielding more, designing more, selling more. So really came to question that as a fundamental issue. So this is what now relates to global warming, because when we had a dip in our economy in 2008, we also had a dip in carbon emissions globally. So they're inextricably linked. So these are difficult questions. So stepping outside of that again into the human, cultural, social domain, as I said earlier, my co-author and colleague Kate Fletcher's Local Wisdom Project was a 5-year research project, and I was part of this. And it was done globally, and there were 7 different colleges, including California College of the Arts, that were involved, where we interviewed people about their clothing and their behaviors around clothing. And what was discovered was that there were many behaviors in place already that are infinitely more sustainable than what companies do, but they're not recognized by companies because they fall outside the central purpose of a business, which is to sell more stuff. So there are all kinds of, like, we turn our garments upside down, inside out, we pass them on to friends, whatever it might be. We keep those materials that are extracted out of the land in use for longer. And she coined the term craft of use, as opposed to craft of making, craft of use. So this has led to my more recent work now, which is much more speculative and sort of borders with the fine artists, I would say, more like provocations. And looking at use, and if you look at why people buy things, it's usually because they want a desire for something new, they're bored of what they have, they want to feel refreshed. It's kind of almost refreshing the self, as an anthropologist friend of mine noted. And so now what a number of us are looking at is, can you deliver that satisfaction of that desire for something new in different ways than making an additional purchase? And so here are some swatches, knit swatches, where the structure is embedded into the knitwear, and you might buy it one way with a dark stripe through it. And when you're bored with that, when you dye it, a completely different structure emerges actually from the knitting. Here, it was an embedded pattern. What I'm trying to explore here is, if it was stained, rather than throwing something away because it's stained, would that stain reveal a pattern underneath and actually enhance the garment over time, rather than it being degraded over time? So really it's trying to get at the cultural and social aspects of things. And then just ending with this, which is it's a collaboration with colleagues at Parsons and Design School Kolding in Denmark, Vibeke Riesberg and Timo Rizanian, where again, we're looking at this temporal aspect of garments. Can they be designed to evolve over time? And this, we hacked an existing garment, white shirts, and passed it through a digital printer to see if it would work, and it actually did. And then we actually constructed garments from that. And you'll see at the center front of that garment there by the placket, there was a glitch where the printer head got stuck on that particular placket, which indicates to us then that that's the wrong kind of construction if you are designing this for a second life. So it's reinforming how we construct garments, reinforming actually what we would teach, maybe something that is good quality in an old system would actually not be, it would actually be poor quality if you're planning for it to go through a printer or to receive a second level of ornamentation and stay in use for longer. So these are the sorts of things that we're looking at, and it can be extended into prints. Can something receive a second, a third, a fourth layer of print? It really makes you think in multiple dimensions instead of just pushing a product out for sale.
When we talk about the arts and design at Berkeley, the designers get credit for being the function people and the artists are the non-functional people. And I really appreciate how much a mix of function and non-function speculation and solutions we had in that presentation. Do you want to take us through your exercise, Lynda, for a second?
I was actually wondering if someone in the audience would like to share one of those stories. And if you're too shy or you don't want to, I have a couple myself. So,
a garment?
As a backup.
A garment that you've had for a while?
I have this white sweatshirt that has rows of high-top sneaker images on it. And my mom gave it to me. I don't know when. And anyone I've ever dated has said, I want that. Give that to me. And I said, no, because for some reason I was like, this is my mom's. This is this special thing. So I've kept it. I never wear it. So I've kept it and kept it and kept it. And my mom was recently visiting, and she's like, I can't believe you still have this.
Anyone else want to share a story? Okay. Here, thank you.
So mine is a tie-dye T-shirt that I got at a Grateful Dead show, and it's falling apart, and I only wear it very rarely because I want to make it last.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's just to say that garments have lives, and we co-evolve with them after the purchase. And fashion isn't just about shopping. It's about all kinds of relationships that we have with each other, with ourselves, with our group, the coding that we send out, that we, the sense of self, sense of belonging. And if we're only looking at the technical side of things in the supply chain, and even environmentalists will actually dismiss our desire for something pretty or as frivolous when they actually have very deep human, they satisfy a very deep human need. And if we ignore it or dismiss that, we actually push away people where it's particularly important. I mean, it's important for all of us, but there are others who express it more than others. Yeah. And so we really want to bring people in. So that I have one story as well from local wisdom where a gentleman, his story was that his favorite sweater was something that he'd bought, I think it was from Zara or H&M. It was from what we call a fast fashion company. And he wore it 2 or 3 times a week, and he'd had it for 15 years. And then he said, oh, I guess I just changed a fast fashion company into a slow fashion company. Just by his behavior. So it's a completely different narrative, depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah, wonderful. I love the idea that we evolve with our garments and the garments evolve with us. Before we go to Q&A, Stephan, do you want to also help connect the dots between the desires for the future, felt and the desires for a future.
Sure, yeah, we're going to need everyone's participation in this. So for the Climate Summit, we did something a little atypical. It wasn't our core work, but it was great for the occasion. We did a one afternoon action where we staged 21 performers in a very unscientific way. And we asked each of them, it was musicians and spoken word artists, and we asked each of them to give a short performance giving their answer by music or spoken word to the question, what do you want the future to sound like? And it was great. We just did back to back, boom, 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 and it was everything from hip hop to classical. We had the principal trombonist from the SF Symphony was there, and he did his improvised thing. We had a homeless person came up and asked if he could perform, and he did a fantastic job. So we thought we'd do a little turbo quick version of this in the house. And so what we'd like to do is just ask you to think, I'll give you a second to think about what do you want the future to sound like. And then just at the same time, I'll count to 3, and then everyone either just say one word or make a sound, and at the same time. And let's see if we can have a communal consciousness come together here and do something cool. So all right, so I'm going to say, think of it for a second. All right, and then 1, 2, 3, beautiful. Should we do that again? One more time. Let's try it one more time. All right. A sound or a word, and then we'll okay. So 1, 2, 3. That was pretty good. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Can we have another round of applause for this incredible group? We wanted variety. We wanted a variety of issues, a variety of sensibilities, and I think we definitely got it. So what came to the fore for people? I think people have index cards and have been. Somebody is collecting index cards. Is that true? Yeah. If anyone has a question, we'll try it that way, because sometimes it can be a little faster for us to get the questions heard if we're not running around with microphones. Maybe we could start off with the first one with a microphone as I'm waiting for the cards. Anyone have a thought or question? Or everybody's writing. Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks. All right. So here's an audio music question. Who was performing the music? And can you get your pieces to play at the SF Soundbox or the SF Symphony?
Very, very good question. So we actually work with real musicians, and we do live performances. For that particular piece you heard, the band consists of, it's Eric Ian Walker, who's the composer. He's also on keyboard. We have a fantastic violinist named Michelle Walter. We have another keyboardist named Scott Brazil. We have Tom DeMuzio on synthesizer, and we have Bill Nordker on bass guitar for that particular band. Yeah. So all live musicians.
Great. Okay. And I guess we'll see about Soundbox.
We'll see about Soundbox. Yeah. Exactly.
Great. So I think I'll take one question that I think could be answered by any of you. Thinking about how individual communities have provided inspiration for larger climate protection movements. Can individual communities continue to provide support for artists, activists committed to environmental awareness? So thinking local into the global, thinking about what local communities do for supporting artists. Whether it's examples or hopes for the future?
I think that communities can support artists in lots of different ways. I mean, we are living in the capital-driven society that we have, and Stephan also was sharing with me about what it takes to put on a live show, and we do need to sell tickets. We do need to have people support the projects financially, otherwise we can't get them done. So coming out to the shows, coming into the spaces, and also being willing to be a part of something that you're not used to. I think the Pew Charitable Trust is always interesting to think about, because they have this data study, and they study audiences all the time, and they say, if you don't bring new people in, you have to go out there and get those people, because art needs new audiences all the time. And so we're looking for people who want to have some kind of adventure and some interest and come join us.
If I could just maybe add to that quickly. Is this on? Yeah, it's on. We see communities as exactly where we're going to be going. That's our strategy. Really calls for not creating music in San Francisco and then exporting it to Tennessee, but rather going to Tennessee and finding respected voices in the arts community there and working directly with them to enable them to drop in this music into their own communities where it resonates in their own communities. So not sort of trying to export it from San Francisco.
Great.
I agree.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Another question, that I also had imagined asking too. We started out with Orville talking about being a fact-based guy, and also hearing about coal plus ice. Now, I wonder if we could circle back to the beginning. Maybe this is for Orville, might be for anyone. Taking things back to the fact and fiction dialectic after having heard this. Do you have any thoughts about what you've heard that reframe how we opened on this theme?
Well, I just think that everybody's so deeply involved in climate change, whether they know it or not. The challenge is to get out of rooms like this in Berkeley, California. How do you get to Wichita? That's a great conundrum. I don't know the answer to it, but if someone gave me a few $1 million, I would take our show to Wichita.
Is everybody hearing that? Is the microphone? Yeah.
Does this work? Yeah. Anyway, I said what I've said.
How to get to Wichita. Yeah. Yeah. How to, in terms of individual communities, thinking about individual communities or different audiences, how to take a conversation like this to Wichita or to Louisiana or, we might think of other places outside of the United States as well. And other places of California, right? Yeah. Okay. Any thoughts about that? Well, it's a huge one, but I appreciate it next to Stephan's answer of like what it might be to take to go to a place and to make music from there.
Yeah, and again, I think it gets back to the issue of moving from the abstract to the personal, because change happens at the personal level, and I think until you actually are able to touch individuals, we're not going to make a lot of progress.
Right. Yeah. There's a question that's more for directed at Lynda. How do you suggest a college student? But this is good. How do you suggest a college student buy sustainable cotton clothing? Companies like Patagonia are just not affordable. I want to buy organic cotton, but it just is not feasible for my budget. So, I mean, it's a similar type of thing when it comes to organic food or things like that. The equity issue next to what we think of as the expense of sustainable product, which Dan might actually even jump in, well, you could, about that issue.
Okay, so the premise of the question to begin with is that the solution is in buying something more, right? So that just I'm just, no judgments, but that I'm just, the way that we think is shaped by the way the system is now, and deviating is encouraged. And one of those deviations that you could do, actually, Patagonia does have their worn-wear program, which a local startup company, Yodel, in San Francisco, does the back-end logistics and online support for. So if you looked at worn-wear, you can purchase a garment that someone else has returned. And because so you can take an old garment and sell it back to Patagonia, or Eileen Fisher, or REI are now also registered with Yodel. And you get some money for it, and then you can take that money and buy something new, or you could buy a worn garment from someone else at vastly reduced prices than what it would be new. And what they're finding is that 60% of the people that buy worn wear have not bought from Patagonia before, so it's more accessible price-wise. So that's one option. And it keeps those resources in circulation for longer. without extracting them all over again. So.
May I just make a suggestion? I believe you said you were on the board of Goodwill. Oh, if you want to go down market, go back and buy some of that 68 pounds you just shed at Goodwill.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Same with jewelry. Buy the upcycled jewelry.
And you can find Patagonia at Goodwill, actually.
And I always worry about this debate because there's this long-standing perception that the green product is more expensive. And that's almost entirely a construct. That's not just that they're inherently more expensive because somehow the organic things cost more. That's because of how we price things. And the number of places that have chosen to take the gutsy move to start to price what economists call these externalities is very few. California has taken a very small step in that regard. Almost every economist thinks that it's insufficient, but yet it's one of the higher carbon prices we have anywhere on the planet. And the interesting movement isn't towards just pricing the pollution. It's also what's called the social cost of carbon. So what's the impact of the internal combustion vehicle, which might appear to be cheaper, but it causes asthma? And yet no one is attacking on the price of treating childhood urban asthma onto the price of cars. And so it might be true that in a system designed to make a few people rich and everyone poor, that these environmental products are initially more expensive. In fact, the work I mentioned of this gentleman, Chris Jones, who just had to step out, we find that when you look at many of these products, even with all of the biases and the subsidies built in for fossil fuels, that actually the green products are often cheaper, but our system of only looking at the upfront cost, of excluding as many of these costs as possible, make them look cheaper, but they're actually much more expensive for the purchaser, for the community, for the earth. And so one of the gutsy moves that unfortunately the rich, like in Berkeley, have chosen not to take is to actually start internalizing some of those costs. And we cannot expect lower income communities to make the first step on something that the rich communities are unwilling to do themselves.
This is, I'm also going to place this question in dialogue with what Dan is saying, because another person in the audience said that during Dan's talk, the person was worried about the blind spot of the Tesla, around the Tesla trucks in this climate change fight. It's that we really should be changing a principle of this country around focused on unbridled opportunity, which has translated into an average American polluting our species. So in part, it's about a mindset change in terms of, as you say, buying, needing to buy something new, or in terms of purchasing power and how we understand economics. But this person was also saying, shouldn't we also be questioning, what we think true opportunity is?
I mean, this is a really deep question because there's lots of interesting new products that one could look at and go for, and there's a movement which is much more popular among European than U.S. academics. I kind of wonder why, about the whole idea of degrowth. And other opportunities to live better by using less, by purchasing less, and by making our economies and our own individual pocketbooks more sustainable, by not needing to buy the new things and by understanding what's the overall embedded feature. So, I suspect that almost everyone in the audience has a cell phone. And some of you have probably thought long and hard about not buying conflict diamonds for your child's engagement or whatever it might be. And yet we all, myself included, have a clear conflict device in our pocket. Because the cobalt, the tungsten, all kinds of things in here are frequently mined in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where conflict is inherent in the materials, and there are some interesting efforts to try to reduce it. But none of us, myself included, have stepped away from the device because we know that it is a version of modern slavery for many people, and so we're not talking the talk. We're not acting the act to talk the talk. It's a challenge, but we certainly recognize that essentially, if two companies, Apple and the Galaxy folks, Samsung, were to be pressured on that, that would be what I think 68 or 69% of the cell phone industry. And so there are some real obvious pressure points that we could all take, but in the rush to do all kinds of things, we've left them behind. But that's a real issue of the batteries that go into the Tesla Powerwall, the materials in our solar panels and all. The question is it better or worse than the goods it's replacing when you replace them in a cycle that isn't throwing out the old to replace the new, which is kind of back to the garment story. But there's a lot of places where the buying pressure would really make a big difference on this. And unfortunately, we're only really just the beginning of starting that push.
Great. I'll close with the last question, adapting one. Oh gosh, sorry, my paper. One for both Kim and Stephan about a question about different genres of music and whether you work with more than one genre and how that might appeal to different audiences or not. And also then Kim, just in terms of your work, maybe a comparison of two very different kinds of audiences that you found your work addressing.
Yes, I think that in 2009 I had spent over 20 years making work for an audience that was in museums and galleries. And not that I don't do that now, but I certainly do it less. And I'm making more work for other audiences, bigger audiences, young people, the internet. My new audience goal is public television, and I'm working really hard on that. I really want to have different audiences. I really don't want to have it leave in a sort of very rarefied audience. And I don't see those things as contradictory either. So I don't want to counterpose them. But yes, I think it's super important for me to diversify my audience. And I too am working with people from the affected areas where sea level rise occurs. So South Florida, California, Cuba, Durban, South Africa. These are some sites that I have been working with people, local people in those areas.
Yeah, so music is a language with many dialects, and if we want to move people through music, we have to speak many dialects. And those are the genres of music. And so, as I mentioned, we have two pieces we're performing right now. One is for string quartet, and then the one you just saw. But these are really the proof of concept pieces. Our plan going ahead, as I mentioned, is really making this as local as possible by reaching out to respected artists across any genre, anywhere in the world, and then working with them to help enable them to create their own music for their own communities and work that way. I think the challenge here is that the piece you just saw there, the little clip from, that took about a year to develop. And so what we're doing now is we're working with sort of a team of our science team, but also some other people outside of it, to work to, you saw that protocol that I showed you, the slide, we're working to compress that so we can go from a year to a much quicker flow through so that we can actually work with multiple artists at a time instead of just one very slow turnover. So that's what we're doing right now. And yes, the intention is to work across all genres.
All right. When we think about many dialects and thinking about different forms and formats and also equity issues and how climate change manifests itself so differently for different communities, I think with this assemble of people, we really got a sense of the variety and of the urgency, and also of some really imaginative, novel ideas about how we might plot the future. I hope you'll help me thank this incredible group one last time.
Orville, I just wanted to say